Hey guys, Liz here. This video is going to be a continuation of my last video where I went over talents and legendaries and more general information, so if you have any questions on that sort of introductory druid stuff, definitely check there. Today I wanted to go more in depth about actual healing gameplay. I'll try to keep it short and I'll follow up with more in future videos, so definitely let me know what things I should go over next. Apologies in advance for the lack of good footage. I'm still on break from pushing keys, so I don't have a lot of good VODs to work with at the moment. But hopefully you guys still find some of the information useful. In this guide, I'll be going over basic healing, heavy healing, prideful healing in cities, damage, and a quick review of add-ons and UI elements and macros that I find helpful in Mythic+. Just to quickly recap from my last video, I generally run these talents and keys, and my legendary is Verdant Infusion. Circle of Life and Death and Memory of the Mother Tree are two other options that are decent that I also have at rank 4. For stats, again, Resto Druids want to go for Haste Mastery for healing, or Haste Versatility for damage. Personally, I've tried to aim for Haste Versatility to prioritize damage more, but I still have a lot of Haste Mastery gear just because that's what I've gotten out of my weekly box. My Soulbind is Naya with these conduits, and I generally use this in all my keys. Resto Druid healing is very much about hot stacking when healing, and while there isn't really a set rotation, there's a sort of priority with your healing spells. First things first, you want to always keep Life Bloom and F-Flow up. You want to keep Life Bloom up in the tank always, ideally paired with a Rejuve, and maintain F-Flow under the tank and group. These two things you should be aiming to do in your keys with very high uptime. Something that can help with this are Weakuras that track the duration of Life Bloom and F-Flow, so you know to refresh them when they're about to expire. I'll link the ones that I like in the description. F-Flow does a ton of healing for its cost, making it incredibly efficient, especially with the Spring Blossoms talent, which adds an extra hot to it, so you really don't want to be forgetting F-Flow. And it's an instant cast 30-second duration ability that is not too hard to maintain. Tell your group to stand in it during any group damage, especially Prideful. I think the rule is as long as 3 injured people are in F-Flow, the spell is efficient, but I don't really think about it that hard. I usually just always have it down under my tank or group, as much as I can in dungeons. I try to aim for 100% uptime on Life Bloom and F-Flow, but don't freak out if you let your Life Bloom drop sometimes, especially while you're in boomkin form doing damage and your tank is not in immediate danger of dying. But usually I do have extremely high uptime on these two spells across the dungeon, and it's definitely one of the first things you should be looking for in your keys. Cenarian Ward is a spell that I also have extremely high uptime on. I just don't put it in the same category as Life Bloom and F-Flow because it has 30-second CD, and part of its high uptime comes from the legendary that Resto Druids use in keys. Verdant Infusion makes Swiftmen extend hots by 10 seconds, so the gameplay with Cenarian Ward is to generally try to line it up so you have a Swiftman available to use when you have Cenarian Ward. So you can use Cenarian Ward, then use Swiftman right away to extend it. You want to focus on extending Cenarian Ward because it's an extremely powerful single target hot, much more powerful than any other hot we have in our kit. If you Swiftman right as Cenarian Ward activates, you will be able to fit in another Swiftman before the hot expires to extend it again. And after 2 extensions, your Cenarian Ward will be coming off of its 30-second CD, giving you 100% uptime on Cenarian Ward. Generally, I load my tank up with Life Bloom, Rejuve, and Cenarian Ward, and then I Swiftman to extend all those hots right as Cenarian Ward activates. Then as soon as my Swiftman is coming off of its CD, I Swiftman all those hots right again to get my second extension. I've started to really enjoy Resto Druid tank healing because of this. I use a Weakauras to track when my Cenarian Ward actually activates, so I know to Swiftman right away, and I'll link that below. Aside from maintaining your core spells, you want to Rejuve members of the group that are taking or about to take damage. For group damage, you want to Wild Growth when the damage hits. Then if your hots are not enough, you want to spot heal with Regrowth. You really want to prioritize having hots up before you start Regrowth spamming. It's not great to be relying on Regrowth alone to top people, and something I see struggling Resto Druids do a lot is just only Regrowth spamming with not enough reliance on Rejuve and Wild Growth. You want to be Regrowthing on top of people that have your hots on them. On that note, Resto Druid is thus not a reactive healer, it's proactive because of pre-hotting, so it takes a bit of knowing when the damage is going to come. For incoming group damage, Resto Druids need to ramp. You want to put F-Flow down under your group, Rejuve your whole group before the damage hits, and then you Wild Growth on the actual damage hit, and then you start spamming Regrowths to spot heal. If possible, you want to Swiftman right before the Wild Growth too to empower it with a Soul of the Forest proc to make that group healing that much stronger. Since Resto Druids need to pre-hot, getting boss timers is really important. For example, for the last boss of Plague Wall, 4 seconds before the Infectious Rain cast, I make sure I have my F-Flow down and I start rejuving people so I'm ready to Wild Growth when the damage hits and start Regrowth spamming right away. If you wait until the damage starts to start ramping, or even worse, start panic regrowthing without any hots out to try to keep up, then you'll fall behind. It's definitely one of the more common mistakes I see with people who are just starting to pick up Druid. In summary, effectively healing as Resto Druid relies on being prepared for incoming damage and pre-hotting. For tank healing, you want to make sure you have Life Boom, Rejuve, and Cenarian Ward up, and extend that with Verdant Infusion if possible. For group healing as Resto Druid, you want to really make sure that you're ramping at the correct time before the damage hits and not trying to catch up after. One of the most common mistakes I look for when Resto Druids ask me for help is if they're struggling to heal AoE dungeon mechanics like bosses and sanguine depths, I look for whether they're timing that ramp on time or not. Are they getting a full 5-man rejuve wild growth ramp out and timing that ramp as the damage hits so they can start regrowth spamming right away? I really want to emphasize the importance of being prepared as a Resto Druid. So beyond doing your basic healing right, there is a lot of AoE burst damage in Shadowlands dungeons, and this heavier healing, for which regular healing doesn't keep up, requires healing CDs. We have 3 major CDs: Flourish on a 1.5 minute CD, Convoke on a 2-minute CD, and Tranquility on a 3-minute CD. My first go-to when heavy damage hits the group is usually Flourish, because it's a powerful short CD, so it's up often. But you do have to set up a proper rejuve wild growth ramp in advance for a strong Flourish, so you can flourish all of those hots. Preferably, you also want to be flourishing a wild growth that has been Soul of the Forest empowered. For moments where I don't have time to do this ramp, or where I'm caught without my hots out and I have to do some emergency healing, Convoke to heal is the best answer for panic moments where you might not have time to set up those rejuves in a wild growth for a good flourish and people are dying. So convoking to heal is definitely sort of my panic button heal go-to, and it will also put out hots for you. So if you're ever caught in a moment where damage hits, you're not prepared, and you don't have your hots out, Convoke is a good button to press. Then you can flourish those hots that Convoke put out afterwards if you need to follow up with even more healing. I'm not as fond of Trank as I am of the other two as a response to burst heavy healing. First, because you need to be standing still for it, and the healing sort of ramps with Trank where it gets stronger toward the end, and you might need healing right away up front. So people might already be dying by then and you might fall behind. I find Trank to be much better once you have a bit of a setup, like you have rejuves, wild growth already, you might have already used Flourish, and then you can use Trank to follow up on that. But I find Trank is super weak to start with when you just use it on 5 people dry without any hots out, and it's not much of a burst heal, like it needs to ramp up a bit. So I try to stack it with other things. When I Trank, for example, on Pride, you can see that I usually have F-flow down under the whole group to make sure people are benefiting from the Spring Blossoms hot, and then I also try to rejuve everybody and have a wild growth and follow it up quickly with a Trank. So my Trank benefits from the mastery of all those hots. For heavy single target healing, your main answer to that will again be Flourish. What you will probably want to do is to Flourish Cenarian Ward, Life Bloom, and Rejuve on the tank, and then continue spamming regrowths into him. This will be a lot of single target healing. Cenarian Ward is again the most important hot here. You want to be extending this hot, you want to be flourishing this hot. Another thing to remember is that Iron Bark does increase the value of your hots on the target that it's on. I went over Prideful Healing in my first video, so definitely check that out first, but I want to add a few more details here. Going into a Prideful, I want to make sure I have at a minimum Flourish up, and usually I need both Flourish and Trank. And on Prides that last a while, I will need all 3 of my CDs: Flourish, Trank, and then Convoke. So you want to track mob percentage in a dungeon, and I have a helpful Weakura that does that for me. It glows when you're in combat with enough mobs to trigger the next Prideful, so you know not to use Flourish on that pack because you've got the Prideful coming up. Flourish is definitely my favorite CD to have on Pride. It's just so good for healing Pride. I go through my regular healing ramp rotation on Pride: rejuves, wild growth, spam regrowths until my hots fall off, and then I repeat this ramp over and over. I usually Flourish after wild growth in this rotation when the healing gets tougher, usually on my 2nd, maybe 3rd wild growth. Then after Flourish, I ramp one more time and I hit Trank right after the wild growth. This usually is enough to get me through a Pride so I can save my Convoke, but if I need more, I Convoke to heal. The reason I use Flourish and then Trank and then Convoke is because I'm usually trying to save my Convoke to use for damage with the Prideful buff after the Pride. Say like before a boss, like Hakar in DOS, where Heart of the Wild, Prideful buff, and Convoke and Boom can form is a lot of upfront damage on that boss that can really help your team. On Prideful, I pretty much use every Soul of the Forest proc on a wild growth, if I have it available. But if one person is in particular danger, a Soul of the Forest proc plus Nature's Swiftness regrowth is like a mini lay on hands. Good communication with your team is also important, so they know when to use their defensives and immunities on a Prideful. You'll usually hear in comms that I usually say when I'm flourishing or when I'm tranking, because I don't want people to panic and start using defensives, health bots, and immunities before they have to, because my CDs are going to top them. When my Flourish is gone and my Trank is done, I usually say I need people to use defensives, I need health pots and whatnot since I'm running dry on heals. Pride is about pressing your own buttons correctly, but good communication can make the difference between living and dying on a tight Prideful, especially ones before a major boss where everyone's saving damage cooldowns. A note about Grievous Week Prideful Healing: you cannot let people drop as low on Prideful as you usually do because they will build up stacks of Grievous and you'll end up having to do more healing than you should. On Grievous Week, I make sure I have all 3 healing CDs up going into a Pride. To combat Grievous, you want to keep people above 90% health as much as possible, so I usually move up my CDs, using them earlier and a bit closer together so people stay topped longer. And I always use my Convoke to heal on Grievous Weeks. So I might flourish my second wild growth instead of my third one, for example, and then I'll ramp again before it falls off, and then I'll hit Trank to follow up, and then I'll follow up that Trank with a Convoke to heal. Some people may have noticed that I play my Resto Shaman now, and for me that's mostly because of damage. Damage is so important to high keys right now. That's the reason Holy Paladin is the top healer. However, keep in mind that ultimately your job as a healer is to keep people alive, and that's going to be your main goal as you climb key levels. And especially if you're pugging, people will most likely be judging you on your healing skill mostly. But doing damage I think becomes important once you've settled in with a steady group and you're really trying to push the ceiling of what you can achieve. A lot of decisions I made on my Resto Druid with reference to stat weights and gear in-game were decisions that I made with optimizing damage in mind. For example, I switched to a more versatility heavy build as soon as I got the high item level gear that I wanted with versatility on it, because like I mentioned in my last video, you want to prioritize case versatility for damage. For actually doing damage as Resto, the first things I prioritize are my dots. I try to keep Moonfire and Sunfire up on everything. Dots are the first priority for doing damage because keeping Sunfire and Moonfire up is pretty value since they're instant casts and it doesn't take too much out of your healing rotation to spend a couple instant globals dotting mobs up. I think on anything that's under like 5-ish targets, I try to Sunfire and Moonfire everything and maintain 100% uptime on those as I heal. If I have extra time to do damage on top of this, then I would ideally be trying to activate my Lunar Eclipse and use that Eclipse activated Starfire on AoE. Starfire really pumps on AoE. On larger packs, depending on how long the mobs are going to live, I might just throw Sunfire and then activate a Lunar Eclipse and just pump Starfires out. It will do a lot of damage. Depending on the dungeons, I sometimes just quickly Sunfire and send out a few Starfires at the beginning of the pack before the damage gets heavy and you have to start healing the tank a lot. And during times I have to really heal, I focus on just instant casting my Sunfire and Moonfires. The downside to Starfire is that it has such a long cast time, you really have to commit a few seconds to shifting into Boomkin form. This means you have to be confident that you're doing it at a time where no one's going to immediately die, and you can be spending time in Boomkin form casting DPS spells. Casting any heal that is not regrowth will take you out of Boomkin form, so I do that to smoothly transition out of Boomkin form rather than hitting my keybind to shift out and then start casting healing spells. On single target, you want to keep Sunfire and Moonfire up, Star Surge on CD, and rotate between your active eclipses. Ideally, you want to be in Solar Eclipse on single target, so going into a boss, you can try to make sure that you have Solar Eclipse ready and available to proc. Ultimately, doing damage on a healer means you have to know when it's safe to stop healing for a couple seconds to get damage out and when you have that time to shift into Moonkin form for a couple seconds. Basically, you want to have an understanding of what mobs hurt and what the damage patterns and keys are, and that will help you see opportunities to play more aggressively. Doing damage is something I'm trying to improve all the time. Right now my damage I feel is a little bit low, and I'm definitely working on trying to find those opportunities to play more aggressively. Just to quickly go over what trinkets I use in keys, right now I prefer to use the Tuft from Sun King and the Changeling from Mists of Turnascythe. The Tuft is really good for saving someone who's about to die, and I find it's a pretty good insurance policy. I like to use Changeling in my second slot because I don't like to use double on use, and the proc is pretty good. I leave my Changeling on haste. Other trinkets that I think are good are the PvP Insignia of Alacrity, the Soul Letting Ruby from TOP, Kabbalah's Hymnal from Sire, and the IQD is fine in some situations if you happen to have a high item level one. For consumables, I use Flask of Power, Shadowcore Oil for damage, and Heavy Desolate Armor. I make sure I'm stacked up with potions of Phantom Fire for damage or Spectral Intellect potions for an intellect boost, which is useful for both healing and damage. I also keep plenty of Spiritual Mana potions and the Sleep Mana potions. Ideally, you use these in an emergency in a dungeon if you're going to run out of mana and can't drop combat to drink. I've linked some of my tracking Weakuras below, like my Life Bloom, Aflo, Swiftmend, and Cenarian Ward Weakuras. Other add-ons that are important are Bigwigs and Littlewigs for boss and dungeon timers, so you know when heavy damage is coming. I use Detail's damage meter to track damage and healing done in dungeons, and I use Angry Keystones for a more detailed dungeon timer. For enemy nameplates, I use KUI Nameplates along with a target of enemy mobs Weakura and a buffs on enemy nameplates Weakura that shows which friendly players enemy mobs are targeting and also what buffs they have. My unit frames are modified with EasyFrames, and I use MoveAnything to move elements of the default UI to where I like them, including my cast bar. I mostly play on default UI just because that's what I'm used to. I recommend setting up something like LVUI or Voodoo for your raid frames if you're interested in something a bit more customizable. I use default raid frames personally, and I track my teammates' CDs next to my raid frames with Omni CD. For macros, I use help harm macros mostly. I also recommend mouse over macros for an easier time healing, although I don't personally use them. That way you can just hover over somebody's raid frame and press your healing spells without having to click it first. Here's an example of a help harm macro I use. This is my Solar Wrath and my Regrowth bind. When I cast on myself, I will cast Regrowth, and when cast on an enemy target, I will cast Wrath. You can replace the spell names in this macro with whatever you wish, and targeting enemy and friendly targets will cast the respective spells. I'll list the Weakauras and add-ons that I use in the description of the video below so you guys can take a closer look. And as always, I'm available to respond to your questions either in the comments or on Discord. I'll be able to give more detailed and personalized advice in text. I don't want to make this too long, so I think that's all I'm going to talk about for today, but definitely let me know if I missed talking about anything that you guys want to know about, and I'll try to include that in a future video. Again, thank you for watching.
Oh no, the castigator's angry. I soothed him. He's happy now.
Is he happy?
He's happy. He's dying, but you know.
He's happy. No, he was angry and then I made him happy.
Oh, okay.
How'd you make him happy?
I soothed him. Nice relaxing massage.
What kind of massage?
How come I don't get those?